royal family.
All of these lies started coming out, but we didn't know that she had told the royal family.
How Prince Harry saw shame doesn't come from strangers screaming insults. Shame comes when the past stands up calmly and says, "We saw this before you did." And that is exactly what hit Prince Harry like a silent punch to the chest. Because the first people who rejected Meghan Markle weren't royal courtiers, weren't tabloids, weren't palace insiders. They were a normal family, long before crowns, cameras, and titles entered the picture. And they walked away quietly. For years, Harry told the world a simple story. Meghan was misunderstood. She was rejected because she was different. Because she was too strong, too modern, too disruptive for old institutions. But now that story cracks. Because according to revelations tied to her first husband, Giuliano, the rejection started much earlier, and it had nothing to do with royalty. This isn't a breakup story. This is a warning story. And the most dangerous warnings are the ones delivered softly. Before the palace gates, before the engagement interviews, before the fairy tale demanded applause, Meghan Markle lived in a smaller world. One without PR teams, without speechwriters, without a global audience to manage perception. In that world, relationships were watched closely, not once, repeatedly. And according to Giuliano's account, his family noticed something they didn't trust. Families don't issue press releases when they sense trouble. They hesitate, they slow things down, invitations stop coming, futures become vague, commitment is postponed, and eventually quietly withdrawn. That's exactly how this first rejection happened. Giuliano's family didn't accuse, they didn't attack, they didn't humiliate. They simply observed patterns, emotional intensity followed by distance, ambition that overshadowed intimacy, relationships that felt increasingly transactional. These weren't dramatic red flags, they were quiet discomforts. The kind families notice when they're thinking long-term. And long-term was the problem. According to what's now resurfacing, the concern wasn't class, jealousy, or prejudice, it was instability. A sense that relationships were stepping stones rather than roots. That loyalty was expected, but permanence was optional. At the time, Meghan reframed that hesitation as misunderstanding, ambition mistaken for coldness, resistance interpreted as fear. And this framing mattered because it became the template for every rejection that followed. But here's the key detail Harry never truly confronted. Back then, there was no palace to blame. No tabloids, no centuries-old institutions standing in as the villain, just a family that chose not to move forward. Years later, when Harry entered Meghan's life, he didn't meet her past as it was. He met a curated version. Struggle without warning. Reinvention without residue. Past relationships framed as closed chapters that required sympathy, not scrutiny. And Harry was primed to believe it. By nature, by trauma, by history, Harry is a protector. He had already cast himself as the man who would finally see what others had missed. The one who would stand between Meghan and a hostile world. That instinct wasn't fake. It was sincere. And sincerity, when paired with selective storytelling, becomes a liability. Inside royal circles, vetting doesn't hunt for scandals. It tracks patterns, family reactions, long-term continuity. And while Giuliano's family wasn't initially labeled a red alert, their quiet disappearance from Meghan's narrative raised eyebrows. There was no loud fallout, no public bitterness, just absence. And absence mattered. Early palace briefings noted gaps, not crimes, not chaos, gaps. A former partner whose family disengaged without conflict. A later marriage to Trevor Engelson that ended abruptly, cleanly, almost surgically, without the emotional bridges people usually describe when reflecting honestly. Individually, these facts meant nothing. Together, they formed a shape. Harry didn't see a shape. He saw injustice. According to those familiar with his mindset at the time, he interpreted any family rejection as proof Meghan had always been underestimated. That caution was cruelty. That hesitation was prejudice. In doing so, he inverted the warning signal entirely. What had been concern became oppression. What had been caution became bias. The palace didn't stop the relationship. Institutions Politicians rarely intervene early. They wait, they observe, they document. Files stay open, notes accumulate. As the engagement approached, some advisors quietly revisited those early silences, not to sabotage the union, but to understand it. Why did Meghan's past contain more exits than continuities? Why did families fade instead of integrate? These questions weren't hostile. They were preparatory. Harry heard betrayal. To him, hesitation felt like rejection, not just of Meghan, but of himself. And so he did what he's always done when confronted with perceived abandonment. He doubled down emotionally. He dismissed caution as bias. He framed concern as cruelty. In doing so, he positioned himself against the very system designed to protect him. The prince, who had spent a lifetime grappling with loss, mistook warning for abandonment. And once that switch flipped, everything that followed became inevitable. Families remember what institutions later record. Giuliano's family didn't reject Meghan because she lacked worth. They rejected permanence because they sensed impermanence. A life oriented toward the next chapter rather than the current bond. A forward motion that required others to disappear once their role was complete. When that explanation resurfaced years later, it landed differently. Not as gossip, as context. By the time Meghan entered Harry's world, her history had been edited, not erased, but streamlined. Relationships became stepping stones. Breaks were framed as growth. Families who pulled away were removed from the story entirely. What remained was a clean arc of ambition and resilience. Harry didn't question it, he reinforced it. Observers from that period describe Harry as intensely protective, almost urgent. He believed he was watching history repeat itself, a woman mistreated by systems, threatened by her independence. It mirrored his unresolved grief and anger toward institutions he believed had failed his mother. The story fit too perfectly, and that's why the warning never landed. Giuliano's family didn't scream. They stepped back, they slowed the future, they questioned alignment. Protective acts that only look cruel when ambition is already pointed elsewhere. Harry interpreted that resistance exactly as Meghan did. As proof she was too big, too driven, too disruptive for ordinary spaces, he recoded caution into envy. This reframing hardened into habit. When Meghan spoke about her first marriage, the emphasis was always on growth, necessary endings, clean breaks. What remained unexplored was the speed, the lack of lingering connection, the absence of shared history afterward. Again, no crime, no scandal, just a pattern. Palace vetting teams are trained to look for continuity, long friendships, family integration, overlapping circles. What they found instead was fragmentation. Different lives, different identities, minimal overlap. When this was raised gently, Harry bristled. He heard judgment where none was stated. He accused advisors of flaw hunting. He insisted the past didn't matter. But institutions study the past for one reason only, to predict. And repetition is their loudest signal. The more Harry defended, the more isolated he became. Not because he was pushed out, but because he chose loyalty over nuance, emotion over precedent. By the time doubts resurfaced later, they no longer felt like attacks. They felt like echoes. The Giuliano family, the Engelson marriage, the palace resistance. 3 chapters, 1 rhythm. And that's when shame replaced anger. Not shame toward Meghan, but toward himself. The realization that warnings had existed long before tabloids, long before titles, delivered by ordinary people with nothing to gain. And he had dismissed them all as enemies. That shame didn't explode, it settled. Harry didn't confront, he withdrew. He avoided revisiting the past because acknowledging the pattern would mean admitting something unbearable, that love hadn't blinded the world. It had blinded him. By the time the realization settled in, there was no dramatic moment where everything collapsed. No shouting, no public reckoning, just a slow internal shift that changed how Prince Harry saw the story he had defended so aggressively. Because once patterns reveal themselves, they don't disappear, they rearrange memory. Inside Buckingham Palace, the tone quietly changed. Not outwardly, not publicly, but internally, curiosity hardened into calculation. Early hesitations were no longer treated as isolated isolated concerns. They were reclassified as indicators, signals that only make sense once enough time has passed for repetition to become visible. This is how institutions operate. They don't react to emotion, they wait for alignment. The Giuliano family's rejection, once dismissed as irrelevant, now sat alongside everything else. The first marriage that ended without emotional debris, the friendships that faded without explanation, the family connections that never fully integrated, individually harmless, collectively instructive. What the palace saw wasn't a woman rejected for being different. It was a life that moved forward by shedding attachments. Intensity, alignment, advancement, exit, repeat. And here's the part Harry struggled to accept. Institutions don't care about intention nearly as much as outcome. They don't ask why something ended. They ask how often. By this stage, it was too late to intervene. Vows had been taken, the world had watched, lines had been drawn publicly. The palace couldn't rewind, it could only adjust. And adjustment in royal life looks like distance. That distance felt brutal to Harry. He interpreted it as punishment, as abandonment, as cold retaliation for choosing love over protocol. But what he didn't understand at first was that withdrawal is not anger, it's containment. When certainty disappears, institutions pull back to survive. This realization cut deeper than any tabloid headline ever could, because it echoed something Harry had already heard once before, quietly, years earlier, from people who had no agenda. The Giuliano family had done the same thing. They didn't explode, they didn't accuse. They disengaged. Now the palace was doing it too. And suddenly, the narrative Harry had clung to, persecution, misunderstanding, cruelty, began to feel thinner. Not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. According to those close to him during this phase, Harry stopped arguing. The fire that once fueled speeches and public defiance cooled into something heavier. Resignation without clarity, acceptance without peace. He began to understand that from the outside, the story didn't look like injustice anymore. It looked like predictability. For Meghan, the palace's recalibration meant something very different. Distance confirmed what she had always believed, that institutions resist change, that skepticism is just fear dressed up as formality. Where Harry felt lost, she felt validation. Another environment outgrown, another chapter complete. This divergence mattered. Harry wanted acknowledgement, Meghan wanted autonomy, the palace wanted stability. Those three goals cannot coexist. And when alignment fails in royal life, the response is never explosive. It's administrative. Exposure is reduced. Access is limited. Warmth fades while formality remains. Titles stay. Protocol stays. Emotional investment does not. This is how royal stories end when they can't be resolved. Not with apologies, not with vindication, with separation of record. From the outside, the headlines focused on conflict. Inside, the truth was quieter and more uncomfortable. The palace wasn't punishing Meghan, it was adjusting expectations. The future would no longer be built on shared continuity, but on managed distance. And that is when the Giuliano family's early decision took on its final weight. They had no power, no cameras, no incentive. Their rejection existed before fame, complicated interpretation. That's why it mattered. That's why it lingered. For Harry, the humiliation wasn't public. It was deeply private. Because accepting that those early warnings were concern, not cruelty, meant accepting something far more painful. That love, no matter how fierce, cannot overwrite pattern. And that his instincts, shaped by grief, loss, and defensiveness, had led him away from clarity, not toward it. This realization doesn't create confrontation, it creates silence. Harry didn't storm palaces or issue ultimatums, he withdrew. Conversations became shorter, revisiting the past became unbearable. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And defending against it only increases the cost. The palace moved on as institutions always do. It absorbed the lesson, adjusted strategy, and preserved itself. But the marriage continued on its own terms. The crown continued on its own path. Two narratives, no longer pretending to be one. This was never about who was right or wrong. It was about how many times a warning can appear before it becomes history. The Giuliano family sensed impermanence early. Not malice, not manipulation, impermanence. A forward momentum that didn't pause to anchor. They stepped away before permanence demanded a price. Harry mistook that signal for cruelty. And years later, standing inside a far larger system making the same quiet calculation, he finally understood what they had seen. Royal scandals love endings, explosions, villains, victors, but the truth almost always lives at the beginning. In ordinary homes, around ordinary tables, where people who have nothing to gain notice patterns long before institutions are forced to record them. History doesn't shout, it waits. And when it speaks, it does so calmly, long after denial is no longer possible.